Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
It's dark as hell. The path leading through the swamp is very familiar. Since she was a child, Dahlia and her grandmother used to go here to pick cloudberries and cranberries. They even went to the protected glades in the deep woods for porcini mushrooms. There are only woods and swamps for many kilometers around. The biggest of the swamps is Dahlia La Cienega. Many years ago, when she was a little girl, Dahlia asked her grandmother why the swamp had the same name as she did. Her grandmother had said it was not a story for children's ears. But when Dahlia grew up, they told her this story. A long time ago, even the old people don't remember the exact year, a local girl drowned herself in these swamps. She just went off the path and drowned herself in the deep swamp. The villagers said she did so out of unhappy love. Her fiancé had left her just before the wedding when everything was arranged and the dowry was ready. The rumors were that the bride yielded to her groom's insistent demands and came to him on a dark night in the field by the river to the soft, fragrant haystack. He took advantage of her naivety, then accused the girl of promiscuous behavior and refused to marry her. She suffered and sobbed and begged her cruel-hearted lover to change his mind, but he was adamant. That's when the unhappy girl went into the swamp. Her name was Dahlia, and no one ever saw her again. At the time, Dahlia laughed at the old story, thinking that the locals had made it up. But now that she found herself in almost the same situation, it was no longer funny to her. She simply didn't know how to go home or how to look her elderly grandmother in the eye. And she had no one else in this world. Dahlia knew a secret place where she and her grandmother used to pick cloudberries, a small glade surrounded by the swamp all around. The only way to get to that glade was through a fallen tree, which had decayed and sunk deeper and deeper into the mysterious mire with each passing year. Her grandmother, getting heavier with the years, didn't risk going there anymore, and she told her grown-up granddaughter not to go there either. But she wouldn't obey her, and every year she brought buckets full of amber-colored sweet Moras de los Pantanos. In their region, in this northern village, they loved this berry more than anything else and would buy it at the local market for good money. This is what she and her grandmother used to do. And then they lived all year long on the money they got for cloudberries in the summer and fall, eating the supplies they picked in the forest. But now Dahlia just wanted to run away, to hide, to get away from people, to have no one around. To fall to the ground as a wounded beast, to howl, to scream with all her might. To release all her anger, all her misfortune, all her bitter grief. Although it was dark, her feet guided her along the familiar route. Her strong, young legs had not once stumbled or let Dahlia down. Soon she had passed over a fallen tree and was on the familiar glade. She collapsed on the ground, lifted her head to the full moon, and cried out. She howled like a she-wolf, feeling bitterly sad, offended by the man she thought was her nearest and dearest. Suddenly, she heard a wolf howl from the other side of the glade where the remains of the old hunting lodge were still standing. At first, Dahlia was very frightened. This howl immediately brought her to her senses. She was in grief, but her instinct for self-preservation didn't allow her to end her life so easily. She lay down on the ground and hid like prey pursued by a predator. A few minutes passed, and the howl continued again and again at equal intervals as if there was something torturing the wolf, preventing it from moving. No one answered this howl, and Dahlia, who grew up in the village, knew very well that if a lone wolf howls and his packmates do not answer, it means the pack has abandoned him for some reason. Sick or old, no one would protect it, according to the cruel law of nature. Dahlia crawled a little closer. The howling was still repeated at the same intervals. Now she could hear the strange heavy breathing, the pitiful whimpering, and the terrible, human-like sighs full of unbearable agony. Caught in a trap? Dahlia thought, but immediately declined such an assumption. Who would set traps here? No one even knows how to get in here. She'd been picking berries here for years and she'd never seen a trace of any human presence. Then what's wrong with the wolf? Maybe it's sick. Poor animal suffering so badly it hurts even to hear it. Or maybe someone's dog came here accidentally chasing the prey, got hurt, and is moaning. That last assumption seemed most plausible to Dahlia, and she crawled even closer to where the unfortunate howling creature was hiding. Dahlia had always been a sympathetic, compassionate, and trusting girl by nature. "My poor little girl," Granny told her, "you trust literally everyone, but that's not right." And that's how it turned out. Granny was right. But there was no time for self-knowledge now when a living being was suffering. Dahlia must have been crawling through the clearing for half an hour without daring to stand up. And this whole time the four-legged poor creature was moaning and crying, howling and shrieking. Dahlia's heart nearly jumped out of her chest in pain and compassion. Finally, she got close enough to the source of the howling to be able to see the lying beast. Its legs were outstretched in a convulsive spasm, ears pulled back. In the dim light of the full moon, it really did look like a dog. A large grayish-brown dog with a white spot on its chest. "Hey, Luna," Dahlia called softly. She said the first name she could think of. The dog howled miserably and wiggled its paws at Dahlia's voice. It finally convinced Dahlia that she was right. "What are you doing here, my poor little friend?" Daijo Ella approached the dog closely. "What happened to you?" The animal wiggled its tail weakly but did not raise its head, apparently not having the strength to do so. Dahlia examined the poor beast. There were no wounds or injuries on its large, powerful body, but its belly was huge, bloated, and abnormally hard. Placing her palm on the dog's belly, Dahlia thought for a moment, trying to figure out how to help her. As suddenly she felt a sharp kick, and then another one. She's pregnant, she suddenly realized. She's in labor. Yeah, not the best place to give birth. You picked the wrong place for this, Dahlia said to her. No one does that, it's crazy. You should have stayed at home in the doghouse. Oh, silly girl. You were probably chasing a hare, so you ran into the middle of nowhere. And then the time has come. Well, that's all right. I'll try to help you. Dahlia had seen her grandmother deliver cows and goats that could not give birth on their own many times. Gloria was known all over the neighborhood for her skills in curing livestock and other small animals. Her granddaughter inherited her talent, or maybe it was God's gift to her, who knows? She used to bring home stray kittens, baby birds that have fallen out of the nest, and chickens that were left without a hen if it was accidentally killed by a hawk. Dahlia loved nature's children, and they responded in kind. Well, let's do the following, she said to the dog. Please lie still, and I will help you. It might hurt a little, but it's better than suffering like this for hours. She fearlessly grabbed the dog's tail and slipped her hand into the birth canal. The poor creature twitched and shrieked, but immediately calmed down and started breathing normally. A moment later, Dahlia retrieved the stillborn puppy. Oh, poor little thing. The girl saddened. Well, maybe the others will survive. Here, you can lick it. She put the puppy under its mother's belly, and the dog began to lick her baby, massaging it with her broad, wet tongue. To Dahlia's amazement, the puppy suddenly whimpered softly, moved, and crawled toward its mother's nipples. Soon the other little ones were born, and the dog calmed down, breathed more evenly, and began to lick her tailed babies. Then she looked at Dahlia, gave a short whine or a bark, and licked her hand gratefully. How are you going to survive here with newborn puppies? Dahlia asked her. I have to take you to the aldea. I can't carry all the puppies at once. And you don't have the strength to go right now. How about you stay here and I'll come back for you tomorrow, okay? The dog stared at Dahlia, but couldn't answer. All right then, Dahlia decided for her. See you tomorrow. She washed her hands in the swamp water and walked back home. Strangely enough, there was no trace of the horrible pain that was tearing her apart. Well, she really had a lot to be sad about. She had been abandoned by her fiancé right before the wedding, like her namesake Dahlia from an old legend about the swamps. The guy was also a local country boy, only he lived near another swamp. He was a few years older than her. He had finished school when she was still young and left for the city to study. After graduation, he returned to his native village. His mother and father told him to find a wife among the locals. The obedient son followed their advice. He arrived, got some rest, and went straight to the local disco. He looked at the local beauties for a long time, but he didn't like any of the girls. So he left the disco and went to the store. That same evening Dahlia went to the store. They ran out of salt. They planned to pickle mushrooms and vegetables early in the morning, so she was in a hurry to get there before the store closed. Dahlia stood at the checkout counter talking to a saleswoman who was desperately trying to find out where Dahlia and her grandmother were picking mushrooms. But her grandmother had taught Dahlia never to reveal such secrets. On the swamps, she said, if you look carefully, you can find everything there. And then this guy came up. He wanted to buy cigarettes. He stood there grinning, but in a kind way. Aren't you afraid of going to the peat swamps, where evil reigns supreme? He said to Dahlia. No, Dahlia answered, I am not afraid. She shrugged her shoulders as if she hadn't noticed the joke. And there's no evil there. Except for the wolves. But they don't attack without a reason. He started laughing, and she felt offended. You're such a naive child. Haven't you ever read Sherlock Holmes? The stranger asked her. No. We didn't learn that at school. Oh, my God. He rolled his eyes. And you haven't even seen the movie about the Hound of the Baskervilles? We don't have a TV. She said, taking the salt and turning to leave. Me and my grandma don't have time for any silly things. And she left. But he was not satisfied and decided to follow her. All the way home, he asked her about everything. Who do you live with? What had happened to your parents? Her grandmother had taught Dahlia to be polite since childhood, so she answered politely to this annoying stranger. But when she approached the gate of her house, she could not stand it any longer and told him straight out. I think you asked too many questions, and you didn't even tell me your name. It's not nice. Sorry, the boy laughed. I forgot to introduce myself because I was enjoying your unique company. He's always been like that. It wasn't clear whether he was joking or telling the truth. He stood like a jester, posing strangely, put one hand behind his back, and bowed to her as if she were a queen from abroad. Let me introduce myself, Richard Lariviere, your humble servant. Dahlia. And now I have to go, sorry. My grandmother is waiting for me. And she left with a loud slam of the gate. He stayed there for a few minutes, looked at the low-lit windows, smiled at some thoughts, and wandered down the path along the houses, gardens, and fields to his part of the village. At home, Richard began to ask his parents about Dahlia's family. The only people left in their family are the grandmother and her granddaughter. And they are not quite sane. Although, there is nothing bad to say about them. The grandmother is a local nurse, not for people, but for all kinds of livestock. For example, if someone's cow is in trouble, they always call Gloria. And she always helps. Actually, we've called on her twice, when our cow couldn't give birth for a long time, and when our big boar hurt his leg and wouldn't let anyone see what was wrong with him. She whispered something, entered his hog pen without any fear, and put her hand on his head. I am talking about our angry boar. Can you imagine? Anyway, some dark things are going on in that strange family. It seems that the granddaughter has inherited all the oddities of her grandmother. The locals even saw them during the big moon. They went into the woods at night to get some herbs. In the Middle Ages, they would have been accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake. Witches? Richard smiled at something. That is quite interesting. It is not interesting at all. His mother resented him. You have to find yourself a normal girl, dear. Don't even think about Dahlia. The last thing we need is some lunatic grandchildren. Don't worry, Mom. The boy said. I was just wondering. And when Dahlia stayed behind the fence with the salt, she didn't immediately enter the house. She waited for a while and came back to look at the man. He walked away with the carefree gait of a man who had nothing to worry about in life. And he didn't even turn around to look at her. Did you go to another village for salt? Granny grumbled irritably when Dahlia returned. There was a queue, Granny. The girl didn't even realize why she had lied to her grandmother. And Dahlia had always told her nothing but the truth. It was the first time in her life that she had lied. A cue? The old woman looked intently into her eyes. Dahlia couldn't stand it, lowered her gaze, and mumbled, "Well, yes." And then a man came in, started laughing at me. The saleswoman went to get salt from the new box, and he started asking me all sorts of questions. And then he started talking some nonsense about the dog, about the swamp. Who was he? The worried granny was ready to protect her dear girl like a bear protecting her offspring. He said his name is Richard Lariviere. Which Lariviere? Gloria wondered, remembering the villagers. He's Simon Lariviere's son. I think so, Dahlia nodded. So older son, if I'm not mistaken, is in the city, studying at a high school. I don't know, Granny, Dahlia grimaced. What difference does it make, anyway? Let's prepare the mushrooms for pickling. There is a difference. Granny replied thoughtfully and didn't ask Dahlia anything else that evening. The Lariviere family in La Aldea was considered wealthy. The father, Simon Lariviere, became head of the large family after the death of his father, Christopher Lariviere. In this house, well built at the end of the last century, there was always strict order and patriarchy. None of the numerous members of the family dared to disobey the head of the family. All the men of the Lariviere family were woodcutters, carpenters, and joiners. They knew how to work with the wood well, with excellent quality. And they were never short of orders. But, a long time ago, bad things were said in the village. Christopher was the youngest of the sons. And allegedly Christopher's father had cheated on his wife with the bride of his eldest son, who had been recruited as a soldier during World War I. To hide the family's shame, the daughter-in-law was kept for the entire term in the house, which was on the outskirts of the village, in a corner near the forest. And the tyrant father forced his wife, Michaela, to put pillows instead of her belly. But the daughter-in-law did not live long and hanged herself in the woods not far from home. And before she died, according to rumors, she cursed the entire Lariviere clan to the seventh tribe. Since then there were often strange and tragic incidents in their family. Either a stillborn baby or a woman in labor would die unexpectedly. Or a strong, healthy man would get sick and leave this world in an instant. So Gloria had something to think about when she learned that Richard Lariviere, Simon's eldest son and grandson of the very same, illegitimate child from the unnatural relationship of father-in-law and daughter-in-law Christopher Lariviere, had paid attention to her only granddaughter. In the morning Dahlia got up before dawn, not even Grandma has woken up yet. And she rushed into the woods again to get berries. She and her grandmother did not keep much livestock. It was difficult for Gloria to take care of the cows. They traded milk and meat from the neighbors for the gifts of the forest. In 2.5 hours Dahlia picked up a bag full of blackberries and rushed back. The path was through the outskirts of the village, past the houses on the outskirts, and the only bus stop. At the bus stop, she saw a lone silhouette standing in the morning sun. The man's hair seemed golden in this light, and the whole appearance was so harmonious that Dahlia involuntarily stared at him. As she approached, she realized that it was her interlocutor from yesterday, Richard Lariviere. He also recognized the girl and waved affectionately. "Hey, Forest Beauty. Are you already on your way back with your prey?" She came closer and answered, "Well, yes, I picked blackberries. Can I try some?" And he already took blackberries. Probar, Dahlia nodded. How could she refuse such a handsome and impudent man? Dulce. The man smiled, and a warm smile brightened his handsome face. So do you. Dahlia blushed. No one had ever said anything like that to her before, and he was a grown man who had already graduated from the university. It's not normal, it's not right. But, still, it was nice. She blushed even more at her own thoughts and, without answering him, turned to leave. But he stopped her, grasping her sleeve. "Dahlia." "What?" The girl looked at him with fear and hope, barely breathing. "I'm leaving now, but I'll be back soon. Wait for me, will you?" "Where are you going?" she asked, and her heart raced like a caged bird. I'm going to the army, Richard answered briefly, and a shadow crawled across his pale face. I'll come back in a year and marry you. Will you wait for me? Yes, Dahlia whispered, but you and I don't even know each other. We have our whole lives ahead of us, he grinned. I liked you from the first moment I saw you. I hope you'll wait for me. I will, she looked up at him. I will, but you must come back. All right, I'll try. He promised seriously, and suddenly he leaned over and kissed her quickly on the lips. It's a pledge, he said, smiling, to make you remember me. And she would never forget him anyway. Then she was frightened by this kiss, running from the bus stop as fast as she could. God, what a shame. What if someone saw? A stray and shameful thought flashed through her mind. Richard Lariviere only grinned at her fright, took out a cigarette, and lit it while looking at the bus schedule. She didn't see him for a year. Life went on as usual, farming, gardening, wood harvesting. Sometimes she accompanied her grandmother to help sick animals. In high school, they sometimes arranged discos and New Year's parties. And there were parties at the village club in their village, too, but she never went there, strengthening her reputation as a strange prude. But she didn't even want to look at anyone after Richard. The adult and experienced guy's plan worked out well. She remembered that one kiss, which he left her as a pledge of his love, forever. However, there had been no love at all on his part. There was only a calculated, reasonable interest. Richard returned from the army alive and well, even more masculine and attractive than he was before. The news that Lariviere's son had returned from the army spread through village with the speed of wildfire. Dahlia heard the news and wondered when he would come to her. He came 4 days later, in the evening. She was doing something outside, and he approached her quietly, stood by their low fence, leaned against it, and looked at her. Hello, Dahlia. Oh, Richard. The girl felt embarrassed. See, I came back to you. You've become so beautiful. He didn't lie about that. Over these long months, Dahlia had grown into a girl of rare and somewhat strange beauty. Her dark brown hair combined with bright violet-colored eyes and swarthy skin. A small nose and cheeks were sprinkled with golden freckles, which not only did not harm Dahlia's appearance, but gave her a special spicy charm, as the city people would say. She already had an adult body, flexible, slender, and very well proportioned. It was a pleasure to look at her. Shall we go for a walk? He asked her, smiling and squinting his eyes, like a cat that saw sour cream. I can't right now, she complained. I have a lot to do. Then later, at 10 o'clock? It would be dark by then. Dahlia was upset again. Don't they let you go for a walk in the dark like a little girl? Richard laughed. Nonsense. She replied. I just. She didn't finish, but said firmly. Okay. Great, Richard smirked. I'll come back later. And he left, as he had done that day, with a confident gait. And again, he didn't look back once. For some reason, it was something that tormented Dahlia's soul and gave her no peace. But she firmly suppressed all doubts and, full of joyful anticipation, began to work with double energy so that there was time to dress up properly. Late that night, when Dahlia came out of her room dressed as if she were a Christmas tree, Gloria immediately sensed something was wrong and asked, Where are you going in that dress? There's a disco at the club tonight, her granddaughter said. I decided to go with the girls. Why? Nothing, Granny snickered and then got angry. Nothing good that my dear granddaughter is lying to me. Grandma, what's wrong? Dahlia was frightened. Why are you talking like that? Why do you? Or do you think I don't know that you're going out with that Lariviere? You never went to any disco. And suddenly, as soon as he came back from the army, you decided to go to the club. Don't lie to me, darling. I've been living in this world more than you, and I know something about life. Well, even if I decided to go with Richard, Dahlia was furious. What then? That's too bad. Old Gloria was sad again. Bad, and it won't end well. But why? Dahlia looked into her eyes with wonder. Why, Granny? Is he really that bad? Maybe he is not that bad. I don't know him, my dear. But their whole family is rotten. What do you mean? Dahlia wondered. What are you talking about? Oh, I can't tell you, but you can take my word for it. Grandma, I think you're overreacting. Dahlia resolutely turned around and headed for the door. It's some kind of village superstition, isn't it? Maybe so, Granny nodded sadly, and maybe not. But one thing is clear to me, I can't stop you. No need to stop me, Dahlia laughed. I'm not going to do anything bad, believe me. I'll walk around village and come back, you'll see. I wish I could believe that. That time she and Richard walked until late at night. He told her about the city, the university, the fun student events and parties, and then about the military service. And she, what could she tell him? How was the day in village gone? How every day, every moment she remembered him, his goodbye kiss. You can't tell that in words. As if he guessed what she was thinking, Richard gently took her in his arms and kissed her, but this time with a long, real kiss. Dahlia's breath caught and the ground went out from under her feet. This is what life is all about, she thought, as she hugged him, too. Do you love me? The girl asked, forgetting about pride and shame. Of course, I do. He assured her and kissed her again. Dahlia was trembling all over her soft body to the point of goosebumps. Are you cold? He asked and threw his jacket over her. Thank you. She thankfully smiled at him with her warm and bright smile. Then he walked her to the gate and kissed her goodbye once more. See you tomorrow, he whispered so gently, so affectionately. See you tomorrow, my darling. See you tomorrow, my love, she answered him, overflowing with happiness. Happiness was not only inside her, it was everywhere. The whole yard, the whole house, the whole world was filled with this radiant, fabulous feeling. She loves and she is loved. Well, what more is there to dream of? Mom, Dad. I'm getting married, Richard said to his parents in the morning, idly, while eating a hearty rustic breakfast. Sounds great, his father replied. And who is your beloved? Dahlia. She is an orphan and lives with her grandmother at the other end of the village. Oh Lord! Mother gasped. Why is the universe doing this to us? Quiet, woman. Father shouted. Why are you cackling like a chicken? Mother became silent with fright. Simon looked at his son. We know her, good girl. Pretty and in with the right body. And the fact that she is an orphan is even good, fewer problems with relatives. She knows a lot about housekeeping and looking after livestock. She will be your helper. Jemima Lariviere was silent, knowing by experience that if her husband made up his mind, it was better not to argue with him. So she expressed her concerns only to her son, later, taking advantage of a moment when her husband was not around. Richard, my dear son, listen to your mother. Don't marry that young witch. Mom, what are you talking about? It's like you're from the Middle Ages. The boy snorted annoyingly. I have a maternal feeling that she will take you to the... Jemima was about to say to the grave, but she pulled herself together in time. And she finished the other thing. In trouble, son. Enough, Mom, the son said. It's just harmful vestiges. It's just your female premonitions. I said I'll get married. And my father approved. Well, you'd better get ready for the wedding. Well, what could she do? Jemima cried, and that was it. If only she had known that Gloria was a reliable ally, maybe the two of them would have worked something out. But Richard's mother didn't even think of going to her and sharing her fears. After all, her doubts and misgivings were in no way about her son, but only about the fiancé he had chosen. And Granny Gloria, hearing such news from her radiant granddaughter, almost went crazy as well. I will not bless you for this marriage. She shouted for the first time ever in Dahlia's memory. Grandmother, what's wrong with you? The girl was frightened. Can you at least explain why you don't like Richard or his family so much? I don't know, but try and tell me, please, maybe I'll understand, huh? I already told you their family is cursed, you know? Anyone who joins their family will be threatened. Well, what was so terrible that happened there? Dahlia was still confused. Some ancient curse? So decrepit that no one even remembers it? Everyone remembers that story. A lot of people remember it. For example, I haven't forgotten anything. Then the grandmother sat down on the bench and cried. Dahlia was really worried. Grandma, stop it, please. Well, how do I understand you if you don't say anything clearly? Grandma? Suddenly the old woman made up her mind and, taking her hands away from her wrinkled face, said to her granddaughter, "All right. I see that there is no other way. I'll tell you everything." Dahlia learned that old unpleasant story from Gloria, but with one detail: the young woman who had been taken as a concubine by her father-in-law was Gloria's mother's sister. Her name was Elena. Elena the Beautiful, as everyone called her. She was indeed beautiful, like in a fairy tale. And that's the kind of horror she has suffered from that damned family. When my mother found out about her death, she went crazy. She didn't drink or eat anything for days. I was just a child at the time and I don't remember, but my grandmother told me later. She and Elena were twins. She and her sister had an invisible connection, as it often happens with twins, bad for one, bad for the other. My mom began to see her dead sister night and day. She kept calling her somewhere, and eventually she went crazy, wandering through the village and the woods like a shadow. And then she drowned herself in the swamp. And her name was Dahlia, just like you. She finished her story and wiped her eyes with the corner of her handkerchief. So, Dahlia was shocked. The story of Dahlia La Cienega is not fiction at all? And the girl who drowned there didn't die of unhappy love? No, not because of love, her grandmother nodded. No one has ever died of true love, but only of human malice and cruelty. But Richard isn't like that at all, Dahlia said fervently, wiping away her tears. He's kind and good. Surely, now he's the best in the world for you. The young blood is boiling. The old woman sighed heavily. But people change. The smallest splinter in the human soul becomes a huge log with age. Believe your old granny. Granny, Dahlia said affectionately, of course, I believe you. But everyone has their own way, you know? I can't live without him if I don't know who he really is. If I don't go all the way. Grandmother looked intently at Dahlia and said nothing to her, only shook her head. The girl left the room, and the old woman, addressing someone else, said sadly, You see, I have done everything I could. From now on she will decide for herself how to live. God give her good luck. Dahlia and Richard's wedding, scheduled for the end of April, was 2 weeks away. Dahlia, pleased that her grandmother was no longer bringing up the sad subject of the curse on her future husband's family, was in a state of feverish euphoria. Everything seemed wonderful to her. Schoolmates came over to help with the finishing of the wedding dress, which the bride had to sew herself, according to a long-standing local tradition. Sitting with needles in their hands, the girls laughed and gossiped, telling each other stories about what awaited the young bride, and discussing the undeniable virtues of the groom. A formal introduction to the parents was scheduled for the weekend. Even though everyone had known each other well for a long time, and Dahlia visited the Lariviere family more than once, it was still an exciting event. There was only one thing that upset Dahlia. Gloria flatly refused to participate in all the wedding preparations and refused to meet the groom's parents. Well, is it really that hard for you? Dahlia, who was ashamed that her grandmother refused to talk to her future in-laws at least once, was trying to persuade her. After all, Simon Lariviere and Jemima Lariviere are not to blame for the sins of their ancestors. Richard's mother certainly had nothing to do with it. Huh, Grandma? She's such a nice, sweet woman. Please, let's go. But nothing Dahlia said worked. Dahlia argued and scolded her, and nothing worked. If after everything you've learned you want to marry him, to be part of this family, marry him. But I won't have anything to do with it, Gloria told her and never came back to the subject. So Dahlia had to go alone to meet his parents. Richard comforted her as best he could, laughing at senile fantasies. Of course, Dahlia didn't tell him everything, but she had to explain that Granny was convinced that they weren't right for each other. When Richard told his father and mother about it, Simon only smirked about something in his long, thick mustache, and Jemima wept, as usual. She'd cried for every single, insignificant thing for as long as Richard could remember. Dahlia entered the house with great excitement, the house that was soon to become her home. Everything here was designed beautifully and with high quality. Some of the furniture had been made in the previous century, but it looked like it would last for centuries. Well-fitted thick logs, an oak staircase to the second floor, all this splendor fascinated Dahlia. "Well, sweetheart, come in, have a seat." The master of the house invited her, waving his hand widely. "Welcome home. It's so sad that your parents didn't make it to this happy day." Dahlia listened to the other things he said, smiling gratefully and thinking that Grandma must have been wrong to accuse such good and kind people of some long-forgotten sin. Richard, her joy and love, was sitting beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders from time to time. "I baked a pie," and Dahlia handed the hosts a lingonberry pie, 2 jars of pickled mushrooms, and a cloudberry marshmallow. "Please, help yourselves. You have golden hands, dear girl," her future mother-in-law told her and shed a tear. "Don't worry," Richard whispered, smiling. "She always cries like that. These are tears of joy." Richard winked at his fiancée. Dahlia smiled, calmed down, and ate a little of what was offered. The food was delicious. And then they poured some homemade cherry liquor and the men had some vodka. She had never tasted alcohol before, so she sipped some, coughing. Her father-in-law, who was sitting next to her, began to pat her on the back saying, "Honey, you don't know how to drink at all." Suddenly, when he said this, he ran his hand over Dahlia's back. He did it in such a way that she suddenly felt unwell. She flinched and lowered her eyes, but said nothing. Richard didn't seem to notice anything, and Dahlia thought she was imagining things. Then everyone went into the large courtyard, and the men smoked. Richard's younger brother, 12-year-old Cameron, proud of his purebred sheepdog given by his father, showed the puppy off, telling everyone how big and strong it would be in a couple of months. Dahlia smiled, stroked the puppy, and explained to the boy how to feed him, and thus she earned his unconditional love. Jemima showed her future daughter-in-law her vegetable garden, plantings, beds, northern grapes, and fruit trees. And everyone was about to go back into the house when suddenly the gate creaked, and a young gorgeous woman entered the courtyard with a baby carriage, in which an infant was sleeping. "Good afternoon," she said to everyone with a fake smile. "Good afternoon," Simon answered her, staring at her with his eyes wide open. "Are you looking for someone?" "Actually, I'm here to see Richard." The woman smiled sweetly. "But it seems you're having a nice family party tonight. It suits me even better." "Ah, there you are." Seeing Richard, she stepped closer to him. "Well, hello, darling." He was silent and only looked at her as if she were a cobra that had accidentally crawled into the room. "Berta?" he said finally. "How did you find me? Why are you here?" "Why?" She laughed bitterly and nastily. "Do you really ask me why?" "I found out you're getting married soon, honey." And she ran her finger down his cheek, smiling sweetly. "But I think you've mixed up the fiancé a little bit. What's going on here?" Richard's father yelled, finally awakening from shock. "Who is she, son?" "Oh, I'll tell you who I am," the woman approached him with a change of tone. "I am your son's wife, and this is his daughter." She pointed to the baby carriage. "Your granddaughter." Jemima spluttered her hands and cried. "You're a liar." Richard finally came to his senses. "You are not my wife." "Oh, really?" The woman was furious. "Would you say the baby isn't yours either?" "Maybe. Paternity has yet to be proven. Richard muttered. I will go to the police and file a report that first you took me by force, then deceived me by promising to marry me. And now you're giving up your own daughter. Then we'll see whether they believe you. The woman cried out in anger. Did you think you could easily get away with it? All right, lady, enough. The father of the family grabbed her by the shoulders and gently pushed her to the exit. You seem to be mistaken. No one was waiting for you here, and no one called for you. Go your way and forget this address before it gets worse. What the hell are you doing? The woman shouted again, dodging his clinging hands. Don't touch her, father. Richard shouted. Be careful, she can accuse you of assault. Simon, Richard. What's wrong with you? This is our granddaughter. Jemima added. But Dahlia was the only one who didn't say anything. Shocked by what was happening, she remained frozen in her seat, watching the whole scene as if from a distance. It was as if she were a spectator in a theater watching a play that had nothing to do with her life. And when everyone started shouting and waving their arms, the baby woke up and started crying and screaming loudly. Meanwhile, everyone forgot about Cameron, and he tied up his puppy and went into the house. At that moment, Dahlia turned around, went out the gate, and headed home. No one followed her, no one brought her back, and no one even noticed her absence. Richard came to her house late in the evening. He knocked at the locked gate, waited for a while, then opened the unsophisticated Paul and knocked on the front door. A frowning Gloria opened the door and, without listening, said nothing but, "Get out of here." "But, listen," he began again, trying to explain something. "I need Dahlia." "Get out of here," the old woman repeated quietly and fiercely, glaring at him. "And don't you ever come here again." He turned and walked away down the path, but at the gate, he turned around and shouted so loudly that all the neighbors must have heard it. "Dahlia, I love you. We need to talk." No one responded to him, and Dahlia didn't hear him, because, just at that time, she was running madly through the night swamp. When she finally came home almost early in the morning, her grandmother didn't ask her anything, but just hugged her tightly and closed her old, tired eyes with happiness, as if she had found a lost jewel again. She thought that now her granddaughter would burst into tears, pour out her grief, and then they could talk, but Dahlia surprised her. She acted as if nothing had happened the day before in her personal life. She said, "Grandma, I need to go back to the swamp." "What for?" the old lady gasped. "There's a dog with puppies. I helped her to give birth at night. She couldn't give birth to one of the puppies, the biggest one. She's very weak, she won't make it to village by herself. I promised to help." Gloria didn't ask anything else. She only put some necessities into her old worn hunting backpack she had inherited from her husband, poured water into a bottle, and gave her granddaughter a piece of bread and bacon. "Here, eat, because you must be hungry." The two of them left the courtyard at dawn and turned onto the familiar path that led to the remote Dahlia La Cienega. Gradually the landscape changed around them, and all signs of human habitation and human presence disappeared. First the tall pines, then the smaller trees. There was not much vegetation near the nearest pond, but further, as far as the eye could see, there were endless peat swamps. When they reached the spot where Dahlia had left the dog and newborn puppies the day before, she helped her grandmother to cross a fallen log and looked around. It was very different now. The scary, swaying shadows were gone. Every bump in the landscape no longer seemed like a silent ghost coming to take your soul. And the gentle rays of the sun were gilding everything around it with their calming light. Dahlia stepped closer to the ruins and called out to her tailed friend from afar. "Hey, where are you, my darling? Where are you hiding?" To her surprise, no one responded, only the birds were singing around her, rejoicing at the new day. Her grandmother also came closer to her and peered over her shoulder. "Well, where's your dog?" "I don't know," Dahlia said perplexedly. "She was here yesterday." And then she heard a faint muffled squeak coming from under the charred wooden beams. Her grandmother heard it too. The two of them walked to the place where the sound came from. They moved their feet carefully so they wouldn't get stuck among the wooden debris and break their own bones. Dahlia bent down in triumph, exclaiming, "Here they are," and pulled out two fat puppies, showing them to her grandmother. "Sweetheart," she said quietly and somehow cautiously, "they are little wolves." "What?" Dahlia turned to her grandmother. "You must be mistaken. There was a big gray dog. She was whining and wagging her tail at me. Only there were a lot more puppies. About 8, I guess, if I counted them accurately in the dark." "That's right," Gloria shook her head. "When they give birth, both dogs and wolf whine and wag their tails to make it easier. And now, she's recovered from labor and dragged them to her lair, and she'll be back for these any minute now." The old woman looked around cautiously, and suddenly, shielding Dahlia with her body, hissed at her. "Put the wolves back where you found them. But slowly. Quiet." Dahlia, still not understanding, also turned her head to the side and saw a huge wolf walking slowly down the log toward them. How did I mistake her for a dog? Dahlia thought to herself as her legs buckled and became as if they were cotton. She didn't have time to put the wolves on the ground, and they were still squeaking, wriggling in her arms. I won't do anything bad to them, don't worry," she began to say to the she-wolf. "Here, take them, but don't touch Grandma. This is my grandmother, I love her, just as you love your cubs." The words seemed to pop out of her tongue against her will and consciousness, and a burning fear ran through her whole being. Meanwhile, Wolf came even closer and opened her huge, threatening mouth. Dahlia squeezed her eyes shut in fear and then felt someone licking her trembling hand. She cautiously opened one eye and saw such a shocking scene. Wolf, with her ears pressed down like an affectionate dog, was standing beside her and licking her hand, whimpering softly. The two wolf cubs were moving between her front paws. "You're very nice," Dahlia told her. "You're a good mother. And you have beautiful babies." Unexpectedly, even to herself, she squatted down and stroked Wolf's large, sloping forehead. "Go on, take them to the others, and good luck." And Dahlia, rising again, smiled so brightly and waved her hands in such a welcoming gesture that her astonished grandmother, standing a little away, thought for a moment that Wolf smiled back at Dahlia. After a moment, the gray predator picked up two cubs with her teeth carefully and carried them through the swamp, through the secret path only she knew, proudly raising her head. They returned home in deep thoughtfulness. They were in the same state until the evening, and at dinner time, Dahlia suddenly said to her grandmother, "You know, Grandma, this all happened for a reason. I know my way now, and it has nothing to do with any man, not even the best man in the world." "What do you mean?" The old woman was worried. "I'll go to the city and study to be a veterinarian," Dahlia laughed. "What did you think I was going to do, to go to a nunnery?" "Well, maybe, I thought about it for a moment," Gloria smiled, too. "It's a very good decision, my dear. Hardly anyone has ever seen what I have seen today. You are gifted by God. You tamed the wild wolf, like St. Francis." "Oh, I didn't tame anyone," Dahlia laughed again. "She just needed help and I helped her. And then she thanked me, that's it. And I realized how simple it is. If you're not afraid and you come with good intentions, no living thing can hurt you. Nothing in the world compares to that, Granny, not even love." Grandma Gloria listened to her granddaughter, and there was real happiness shining in her eyes. Dahlia enrolled in the veterinary science department, just as she wanted. Grandmother Gloria gave Dahlia almost all of her savings for such a case so that her granddaughter could properly settle in there and study in peace without needing anything. Dahlia met her expectations. And it couldn't have been otherwise, because she had found her true calling. The best student in her class and then in the entire department, she graduated with honors but turned down an offer from the administration to enroll in graduate school in order to stay in the department to teach. "You see, Grandma, I want to practice," she explained to her aged but still perky grandmother. "I don't want to sit bent over like a shrimp over books all my life. I'm going to open my own clinic." But that requires a lot of money. Grandma Gloria lamented. Where are we going to get so much money? I've already taken care of that, the granddaughter squinted slyly. First of all, I was constantly saving money, and almost all the money you gave me, I invested in the shares of a joint venture at our university. And, it paid off. Secondly, in my last year, I applied for a grant for young entrepreneurs. There are so many opportunities now. And I was approved to open my own clinic, and not somewhere in the city. There's a lot of competition, but not far from here, in the neighboring village. Who are you going to treat here? Grandma looked at Dahlia in confusion. Have you lost your mind in the city? Who will come to you here? Grandma, do you think I don't know anything about life? Do you still think I'm a silly little girl? Dahlia said affectionately and stroked her wrinkled hand. Don't worry, I already have the necessary clientele. I wouldn't get a grant without a viable business plan, you know? But Grandma still didn't understand anything, blinking helplessly. Did you hear they were opening a new farm in village? Granddaughter asked her, approaching from the other side. Of course. Gloria was happy to hear something familiar and close to her. This event has been discussed for 6 months in village and the surrounding villages. Well, here I am, and I'm going to be their vet on a contract basis. I will provide service and treatment for all their livestock, vaccinations, diseases, routine immunizations, examinations, and certificates before the show. No matter what happens, they will only have to come to me. Is that clear now? Granny threw up her hands again. Well, how can you handle it all alone? Dahlia could not stand it anymore and laughed out loud. There's no pleasing you. Come on, choose. What are you worried about? About the lack of clients, or about too many of them? And seeing that the old woman was about to be offended, said peacefully. Well, do not be offended, I was joking. Of course, I will hire assistants. And the main thing is that I will always be with you. I'm going to live here at home. But how? The old lady was about to open her mouth to ask how her granddaughter was going to get to the neighboring village every day, but realized that Dahlia had an answer for that, too. And she just waited for her to say it herself. The granddaughter understood this clever tactical move and, hugging her grandmother, said quietly, smiling, The bank approved my loan and I bought a car there. Look, it's near the backyard. Well. The old lady said, looking at the new white car. Do you even know how to drive it? She asked her granddaughter, cautiously touching the door. How do you think I got here? Dahlia opened the door, inviting her grandmother to get in. Please, come with me to the neighboring village. I'll show you where my clinic would be. And her grandmother, crossing herself and groaning, took the front seat, like an important lady in her own carriage with a personal driver. Meanwhile, the Lariviere family was expecting the birth of their third grandchild. By all signs, this time it was finally supposed to be a boy. Old Simon had already annoyed all the relatives and had eaten everybody's brains, as his daughter-in-law, the perky and beautiful young woman, used to say. She unexpectedly showed up at their house the day Dahlia met Richard's parents, and since then, they had been through a lot with her. This lady, Richard's city lover, whom he had never even thought of marrying, was 8 years older than Richard. They had met during his happy, tumultuous college days and continued to see each other even when he was in the army. The military unit was not far from the city, and soldiers also had weekends. After Richard was in the army for the first 6 months, she got pregnant and decided to keep the baby. By the end of his enlistment, he was a young father. He didn't say a word to his parents, but Berta decided to rectify this unfair situation herself and, being a stubborn and proactive lady, got his address and came to this remote village to find her runaway boyfriend. At first, she only wanted to get some money from him, or rather from his wealthy parents. But, time after time, coming here and making scandals, she suddenly realized that she liked it in this remote village. There was untouched, beautiful nature all around, and the Lariviere family home was truly beautiful. The eldest son had a separate part of the house with his own kitchen, bathroom, and even a sauna. Simon, a hereditary construction worker, could afford it. Berta thought that it would be better here for little Nina, Richard's daughter, than in the dusty city. The only thing left was to force Richard to marry Berta. She had no doubt she could do that. The possible rival, the scrawny, pale girl Richard had been so carelessly planning to marry, had eliminated herself, running off into the city as soon as she saw her on the horizon. And Richard did not miss her long. And when Berta came to their home for the third time, the man understood and agreed to everything. Simon didn't seem to care who his son married, as long as there were grandchildren. And in this case, there was a clear confirmation of his daughter-in-law's fertility, a healthy, living granddaughter. Generally, Jemima loved her granddaughter very much, so she immediately accepted both Nina and Berta. So Berta, an iron woman and a fighter, joined the family. She came like a snow whirlwind. A year after their modest wedding, they had their second daughter, a healthy and quiet girl. They named her Posy, after Berta's mother. Jemima cried with happiness, Berta was very happy, and Richard was almost indifferent as to everything that was going on in his family. Simon, on the other hand, was not happy. "Oh, now he's going to have only girls," he grumbled, though he didn't miss a chance to playfully pinch the pretty daughter-in-law with big breasts. And now, more than 5 years after his son's wedding, Simon had the chance to have a grandson again. Simon was looking forward to this event with great anticipation. He was zealous to make sure that their ancient family name did not disappear. And he was ready to take part in the process himself, if there was any need. Richard was a weak man, despite his apparent manliness and natural handsomeness. He tried his best to avoid any conflict, and domestic women's scandals were like a knife to the throat. Richard agreed in everything with his so unexpectedly found wife and soon got a reputation as an inveterate henchman in village. Moreover, he began to drink alcohol often, which in no way helped to improve his reproductive ability, which was so important for his aging father. When Richard was drunk, he longingly thought, and sometimes even told his drinking companions how he was suffering because of his lost love. Though even if he had really married Dahlia, his supposed life with her would hardly have been much different from his present existence. Perhaps at first, he would have really felt like the proud husband and young leader of the Lariviere family pack, and the young wife would have obeyed him and smiled at his every word. But only for a while. Dahlia, like her successor in the unfulfilled position, was not a stupid girl. And now, having changed from a naive country girl to an enterprising young lady, she recalled with wonder and self-pity the events of 5 years ago. It was surprising that her feelings for Richard had immediately left her as soon as she found the pregnant she-wolf when she was thinking about drowning in the swamp. Dahlia was busy with her work, and she forgot about all the sentimental nonsense like love and marriage. In the city where she'd spent her college years, she hadn't had any men either. She was totally immersed in what she loved, and she just didn't need that side of life. Numerous men of all ages asked Dahlia to marry them, but she said no to all of them. Dahlia wanted only one thing, to work for her own good, doing what she loved and helping all living creatures. And in the Lariviere family, a girl was born again, the third granddaughter. Simon was furious. Even the lively Berta, exhausted from her difficult pregnancy and childbirth, was frightened by his violent tantrums and threats. Hearing him yelling and cursing behind the wall, she tearfully asked her husband, which was not her usual thing. "Richard, what happened to him?" "Don't worry, he will yell and then calm down," Richard answered, looking at little Jemima and smiling at her. Over the years, he became even more phlegmatic than ever, and it seemed as if he was happy that they had a girl again. He carved an interesting wooden rattle for her, cared for the baby, and even fed her from a bottle himself. Looking at this, Berta and her mother-in-law, in whose honor the girl was named Jemima, smiled. And Dahlia had her new life in full swing, becoming the owner of the veterinary clinic, as she planned. Her focus on farm animals proved to be the right one, and the veterinary clinic thrived with a steady income. Looking at the young, active, successful veterinarian, people from all around began to come to her. Some would bring their cats, some would bring their dogs, and some would even bring their goats. Gradually, she got regular customers. Besides, upscale residential neighborhoods were built around the old swamp villages. Businessmen purchased land there and built real palaces. They, or rather their bored wives, were willing to pay a lot of money if they needed to clip the claws of their poodle or neuter a Persian cat. But Dahlia didn't like these new rich clients. She didn't like to explain to a girl with fake silicone breasts and long fake nails that removing her cat's claws is a painful procedure that would hurt the animal, and she would never do it. Fortunately, most of Dahlia's clients were intelligent people who truly loved their pets and followed the young doctor's recommendations. Grandma Gloria was immensely proud of her grown granddaughter and walked around village proud and imposing. But one year, the year after the birth of little Jemima Lariviere, was very difficult. It was a terrible drought during the summer and everything had dried up. And it seemed that even the bottomless Dahlia La Cienega was so empty that it was safe to walk in places where previously no living thing could take a step without the risk of sinking forever in the viscous mire. And that year, in late autumn and winter, attacks of wild animals on livestock became more frequent. There was a bad harvest in the forests and fields, meadows, and marshes. The offspring of small animals and wild ungulates, the main source of food for predators, died during the dry summer with no food. Bears and wolves began to approach villages and towns closely. One evening Dahlia was already locking the front door with the alarm when suddenly she thought she saw some large gray shadow flicker in the creeping twilight. Another one has come. Dahlia thought tiredly and pulled out a special bait mixed with a sedative from the pocket. They used it here to catch and then sterilize stray dogs, which multiplied near the surrounding villages and towns. Such stray dogs often came to the clinic. "Come here," Buddy Dahlia called to the dog, holding out a piece of food and looking around to see if it was coming. A dusky silhouette separated from the distant trees, and with a silent gait under the light of the lantern came Wolf. Dahlia recognized her at once, though she couldn't tell by what signs. No doubt it was the same wolf that Dahlia had once helped to give birth in the swamp. The animal stood about 10 meters away, looking very emaciated. The big attentive eyes looked begging and mournful. "Oh, my poor little girl." Dahlia spoke softly. "You have had a hard time." Wolf, as if she had been waiting to hear Dahlia's voice, came even closer and now looked at her with certain hope. "Well, wait here. I'll be right back," and Dahlia, opening the door again, disappeared behind it. After a moment she came back, afraid that her forest guest had gotten frightened and run away. But she was here, only moved back a bit into the shade of the trees again. Dahlia walked a little closer and placed a large beef leg on the neatly trimmed lawn. It was a strategic supply of food for the few ever-changing wild dogs waiting their turn for surgery in the clinic's enclosures. Today, as if on purpose, there were no dogs there. Apparently, that's why Wolf dared to get so close. Otherwise, the dogs, smelling the forest predator, would make a terrible noise. Wolf approached the food slowly and cautiously, sniffed it from afar, twiddled her big nose, and looking gratefully at Dahlia, grabbed her prey, and immediately disappeared into the darkness between the trees. From that day on, she came regularly. Dahlia laughed as she told her grandmother that she had once named this gray predator Luna, thinking she was an ordinary pet dog. "But I still don't understand one thing," Dahlia said to her grandmother, sitting in the warmth of their home over tea with raspberry jam. "Why did she come to give birth in the swamp then? I always thought that wolves were supposed to give birth in a den, in a ravine, where it was quiet and safe. And Luna decided to lie down in a place that was accessible to absolutely everyone. What would she do if another predator, such as a bear, decided to gobble her up? After all, she was completely helpless. You know, Dahlia, I think that she came out of her den, which was somewhere nearby, on purpose, so that you could help her," Grandma Gloria told her. Wolf heard human footsteps and crawled out to get help. Animals are also living beings, and they also have a soul and a mind. Remember how affectionate and obedient that she-wolf was the next day? Dahlia and her grandmother laughed and talked about that old incident and their fright, which turned into an adventure. "And now she has come to ask for help again," Dahlia said. "But, can I refuse her?" "Of course, you can't," the grandmother said with conviction, "otherwise she will go and eat cows and goats." So Dahlia had been feeding Luna the she-wolf during winter and most of the spring. It got to the point where Wolf began to respond to the funny name the human gave her. Dahlia never told anyone much about her relationship with the wolf, except her grandmother. Eventually, she managed to lure Luna away from the clinic to their secluded house on the outskirts of the village. In the evening, when it got dark and Dahlia returned from the clinic, Grandma would set dinner, and then the daily ritual would take place. The young woman would go out of the gate with a big piece of meat in her hands and call out, "Luna, Luna." After 2 or 3 minutes, Wolf showed up. She was already waiting somewhere nearby. She would quickly run up and grab food, not forgetting to look at Dahlia with gratitude and even wag her tail. And then she disappeared into the woods like a gray lightning. But all bad things come to an end. This hungry and long winter was finally over. The snow began to melt, the first spring flowers showed up, and the river behind the village broke the ice and spilled among the bare black trees. Big floods didn't happen, everything melted in a week, and real spring arrived. All living things started to wake up, shaking off their sleepy winter gloom, chirping, running, and reaching out to each other. In the middle of March, Luna stopped coming. Now she will take her new cubs for walks. She gained enough weight eating our food. Old Gloria laughed. Wait, Luna will come to you again for another labor. Berta Lariviere strolled with her daughters along village, smiling happily at the warmth and spring sunshine. The girls ran and played, enjoying the April warmth, and launched white paper boats into the sparkling streams. Berta was absolutely happy with herself and her life. Richard hadn't been drinking lately, had been working hard, taking care of the children, and had been nice to her, and the sawmill was making a good income. The only thing that bothered her a little was the constant presence of her longtime rival, Dahlia, in Village Loser. But almost 3 years passed, and she didn't disturb them in any way. Dahlia only came home late at night, working hard all day at her clinic, and the clinic was in a neighboring village. Richard showed no interest in Dahlia either, so Berta soon concluded that Dahlia was no threat to her. And she calmed down. And everything would have been fine if it hadn't been for Simon. Not getting the grandchild he wanted, he started drinking heavily instead of Richard. Sometimes he didn't even come home at night, and that was better than his drunken returns in the middle of the night, the loud yelling, and the tears of the kind-hearted Jemima. Berta, who had not known affection from her mother, a formerly strict teacher, had become really attached to her. One day Richard had to go to the city on business. He planned to stay the night there so that he would not have to drive on the dark road late at night. Berta, after scolding him a little for educational purposes, calmed down, kissed her husband goodbye, and even packed some sandwiches. She invited Jemima for evening tea, and she happily came over to chat and play with her grandchildren, whom she adored. Simon was also away, and the two women looked forward to a quiet family evening. When Berta and Jemima had just made themselves comfortable on the sofa and the first images of their favorite movie flashed on the TV screen, they heard loud footsteps, coughing and cursing at the front door. Then the door, which had never been locked, swung open with a heavy foot strike, and Simon entered the room heavily drunk, with red, beastly eyes, and shaking with rage. Jemima turned her head towards him. "Darling, what's wrong? So, have you decided to relax here?" he shouted, stepping on the clean floor in dirty boots. He hadn't even bothered to take it off. "Why are you shouting? It frightens the children." Berta hissed and waved her arms. Simon grinned unkindly, unzipped his jacket, and began unbuckling his heavy belt with his alcohol-shaking hands. "What are you doing, darling?" Jemima shouted in horror as he tried to take off his trousers as well. "Stop it right now and go home. You've mixed up the doors." "I haven't mixed up anything," the drunken man told them hoarsely, walked close to the sofa, and grabbed Berta by the thin white neck. Dahlia was driving home from nearby village as usual on a dark evening. The road went through the woods, and in one place, it came very close to the fence of the Lariviere house. Dahlia hadn't felt any emotion driving through this place anymore. And sometimes she didn't even pay attention to the glimpses of houses. She was just keeping her eyes on the road, especially late at night. Country roads were not paved highways, you could get stuck. But today, something caught her attention. A flickering silhouette confused Dahlia's tired gaze. She involuntarily slowed the car and saw a frightening scene, half-dressed women running around the courtyard, screaming and begging for help. She could hear loud children crying and see a large, heavy man crawling out of the ajar door of the Lariviere house. He was looking wounded for some reason. In the darkness, she could not see who it was. Have they been attacked by someone? By some criminals? She had no choice but to stop the car and open the door, shouting as loudly as she could. Come here! Come here, quickly! The women started running around the yard again. One of them rushed towards the car but stopped, looked at the house, and shouted, There are my daughters, the girls are home. Dahlia always had vials of sedatives in the car to put the bulls and boars to sleep for surgery. And she rushed to the back seat to get it, but before she could find it, someone heavy fell on her from behind, pressing her down with his heavy body, grabbing her hair from behind, and squeezing her neck. Ah, another lady is here. All right, sweetheart, I'll take you, too, he said in a low, hoarse voice, and Dahlia was horrified to recognize her failed father-in-law, Simon Lariviere. At that moment, it was as if her grandmother's terrible stories had come to life, and her past returned, enveloping her in a terrible fog, blocking her from breathing. And horror chained her movements. Suddenly a wolf howl was heard, and now it was getting closer and closer. She could already hear the hot animal's breath. Dahlia felt a kick, and the man fell away from her like a rag doll, falling into the mud beside the car. She collapsed helplessly onto the back seat, crying and shivering, and then she felt a warm and soft tongue lick her wet cheeks. A few days later, when all the victims had recovered and been discharged from the district hospital, and a scandalous investigation had come to its conclusions, Berta was talking to Dahlia, sitting at the table in her and Granny Gloria's modest little house. When you pulled up, Jemima and I already managed to escape outside. We were almost naked and mad with horror. Berta dropped her head in her arms and cried, thinking back to the horror of that nightmare evening. He would have taken me by force for sure. He grabbed the gun and kept shouting that he was going to make himself a grandchild now since his son was incapable. The old bastard's gone mad. Thank you, Dahlia. I'll beg your forgiveness for stealing your fiancé back then. We're all so grateful to you, me and Jemima, and the girls. Please, stop it, Dahlia said indignantly. Everyone would have done the same if they were in my shoes. Not everyone, Berta shook her head. When that scoundrel saw us running out of the house, he started crawling after us, and he still had the gun in his hand. But he must have caught his gun on something because we heard a shot. When you stopped, he suddenly got up and started walking towards your car with some kind of crazy inhuman energy. So fast, it was like he had a new battery inserted in him. Geez, I'm still shaking with horror. Anyway, he attacked you when you were in the back seat looking for something. You started screaming, and I ran back to the house. I thought I'd find another gun and kill the monster. Seriously, I would have shot him. But then we saw this huge dog running out of the woods like an arrow. We didn't realize it was not a dog, but a wolf. The beast ran to your car, jumped on Simon's back, and grabbed his throat. He fell straight into the mud, and the wolf jumped off and attacked him again, tearing his throat until he was no longer moving. What a frightful sight! Berta shivered again. It wasn't a wolf, it was a wolf, Dahlia said quietly. Yeah, a wolf, Berta continued. When we saw that creepy beast get into your car, we were so frightened. We thought it was going to kill you. But then we heard from behind the fence that you were kind of crying, but not screaming. And someone was whimpering like a dog. We didn't understand anything because of the shock and all this mess. We approached the car slowly, it was so scary. And this huge beast stood on its hind legs near the car and put its front paws on the seat and licked your face. My mother-in-law and I were shocked. I thought that we were hallucinating. And Berta laughed nervously. Then an ambulance and the police arrived. Well, Wolf immediately ran off into the woods and disappeared without a trace. Luna, Dahlia said with a smile. Her name is Luna. A few months later, Jemima and Berta sold their old house, where Lariviere had lived and worked for generations, committed terrible deeds, and died paying the price. The poor women could no longer stay there. They used that money to buy a new modern house in a neighboring village and moved into it together. Richard didn't say a word. He accepted his wife and mother's decision, realizing what his insane father could have done. And a strange woman, an animal doctor, still lives in the small village on the outskirts near the forest. The villagers say that strange things are happening near her house. When the moon shines brightly over the vast swamps on dark nights, a large gray wolf comes to her little house, whining softly and looking straight ahead with her big clever eyes. A woman comes out of the house at this sound. It is difficult to tell her age. She always looks good and the same, as if time has no power over her. The woman puts her small, warm hand on the wolf's head and they walk off down the path that leads to the mysterious deep swamps without looking back or regretting anything.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.